in the breakout room earlier, as a group, EM NARI has really held together and done a pretty amazing job of sticking together and supporting each other. And Michelle, you and your staff, Danielle, Dawn, and Joanne have done a really, really amazing job of holding the organization together, and certainly could not have been possible at all without a lot of hard work from all three of you. So thank you very much for that. So again, thank you everyone for such great support of the organization in 2020, and I'm certainly looking forward to 2021. And it is my very exciting pleasure. I'm excited to have the new president of NARI come in, Kathy Follett. I'd love to, I guess this is quite different, but I am going to virtually administer the oath of office for you, Kathy. So Kathy, I don't know if I can see you, but if you're unmuted so that we can hear you, that'd be outstanding.
I'm unmuted.
Good. All right. So I'll administer the oath of office to our 2021 chapter president, Kathy Follett. Kathy, would you mind raising your right hand and repeating after me, please?
Sure.
I solemnly swear to perform the duties
I solemnly swear to perform the duties
of my NARI position as president and board member of the Eastern Mass NARI chapter
of my NARI position as president and board member of the Eastern Mass NARI
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my ability.
And I also swear to uphold the bylaws and the best traditions of service of our NARI chapter.
And I also swear to uphold the bylaws and the best traditions of service of our NARI chapter.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Yeah.
Welcome. We look
Thank
forward
you.
to your leadership. Kathy, would you now please induct the new or continuing board of directors for NARI going
Sure.
forward?
As I face the crowd. On behalf of the officers and board of directors of the Eastern Mass chapter of the National Association of the Remodeling Industry, it is my pleasure to install the officers and board of directors of EM NARI for 2021. With the following individuals nominated to serve as 2021 board members, please unmute their speakers now. If you would. Justin Zeller. Thanks, Justin. Eric Adams from Adams and Beasley. Megan Taylor from Taylor HR Group as our secretary. Jim LaValle Systems, and our treasurer. Also our directors, Kathy DeMeyer with Encore Construction, Bill Farnsworth, Custom Contracting, Inc., Peter Feynman, Feynman, Inc., Asher Nichols from Asher Nichols and Craftsman, Ron Pike from Alpine Environmental, Stephen Ross from Commonwealth Financial Group, Vaughn Salami from Vaughn Salami and Associates. In accordance with the bylaws of EM NARI, when you were nominated for office, you were asked if you would serve if elected. Having answered in the affirmative, you have made a commitment to this chapter and its members. Now I would like for you to reaffirm that commitment in the presence of the membership. Please respond, I will. Will you commit your time, effort, and energy toward reaching the goals of this chapter, which have been established for the overall improvement, security, and future of your industry?
I will.
Will you commit your time, effort, and energy to create an effective team with your fellow officers and members to achieve these goals?
I will.
Will you commit to uphold the bylaws of this chapter and the bylaws of the National Association of the Remodeling Industry?
I will.
You have been nominated, elected, and charged with the responsibilities of your offices. So I'm supposed to turn to everybody in the audience and congratulate them. We want to, you, the members of Eastern Mass NARI, have just heard of your offices and board of directors commit to work with all of you to achieve the goals of this chapter. On behalf of the officers, board of directors, and staff of EM NARI, I commit you our support in any way possible to achieve the goals of EM NARI. Each of you, as concerned professionals in the remodeling industry and as members of this chapter, must also make a commitment of your time, effort, and energy to support these officers and directors by serving in some way, hopefully, during the upcoming year on a committee, at an event, or by committing yourself to bringing new members into the chapter, which we really need. So everybody, congratulations. I appreciate your commitments. And at this time, I believe I'm introducing Kermit as our speaker. We all are looking forward to this today. Kermit will be offering his 2021 remodeling industry forecast. Looking forward to this. Kermit is a senior research fellow at the Joint Center and the project director of the Remodeling Futures program. This research effort, which began in 1995, is the first comprehensive analysis of the U.S. remodeling activity ever undertaken by the Joint Center. Its goal is to develop an improved understanding of the dynamics of the U.S. repair and renovation industry so that businesses can better take advantage of the opportunities that this market offers. Baker is also the chief economist for the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, he analyzes business and construction trends for the U.S. economy and examines their impact on AIA members in the architectural profession. Prior to joining the Joint Center, Baker was vice president and director of the economics department at Reed Business Information, where he was responsible for industry forecasting. During his 10 years at Reed, he developed the top U.S. construction market report and served as editor of the Reed Business Information's construction market forecast newsletter. Baker received his master's degree in urban planning from Harvard and holds a PhD from MIT in the same field. Having said that, I welcome Kermit.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Good to be here again. Let me see if I can get my my presentation up here. Can everyone see that now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes.
I'll assume the answer is yes. This is probably my 10th or 12th year at addressing this group, and it's great to be back again for this traditional remodeling outlook presentation, even if it is a virtual event this time. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make this event last year, and look at how the year shaped up as a result of that. So let's hope we'll be dealing with a much less eventful 2021. We're busy working on our semi-annual Improving America's Housing Report. We're going to be releasing that in March of this year. So I'll discuss some of the topics we're dealing with for that report, as well as the typical industry outlook issues that I normally cover at this session. So I'm gonna deal with three topics over the next 40 minutes or so. The first is some background on what's going on in the broader residential market, as well as some basics regarding the home improvement market, both nationally and locally. Secondly, a review of what happened in the home improvement market last year. Still sorting that out, as are a lot of you, I'm sure. And then finally, some of the issues that are going to shape the industry this coming year, and what we expect to see in sort of basic market conditions for 2021. So let me start with some important indicators in terms of the health of the residential sector. I've got these through third quarter of last year compared to the same period in 2019. We'll be updating these shortly with the fourth quarter numbers, but I don't expect they're going to change a lot. I think the pattern is pretty well established in terms of what we're seeing. So let me run through some of these indicators. Housing starts at the top of the list nationally. They bounced back very nicely after the downturn as the pandemic hit. Expectation is that housing starts in 2020 exceeded the levels in 2019, even with the real serious hiccup that we saw during the pandemic. Secondly, existing home sales, likewise very strong last year, largely limited by an inventory shortage, or we may even seen more growth in activity on that front. Thirdly, house prices, they continue on their upward path, although I will cover a little bit of this later in terms of, prices have been a bit more volatile in some markets than others than we traditionally see. And then retail sales at building material supply stores, one of the big surprises in the economy this year. As you can see, strong double-digit growth over the same period a year ago, which is one of the reasons that we've seen so much consolidation in the industry recently. We're seeing this consolidation surge that I think continues to be underway. The bottom one is I think sort of just consideration that we are dealing with some tough issues still. We're still clawing out from a steep economic downturn, and will continue to for most of 2021. As you can see from this consumer sentiment index number, consumers remain worried about the economy now, where it's headed over the next few months. And I think that's an issue that we're all going to need to think about and deal with in terms of the outlook for the industry. So house prices, as I mentioned, somewhat surprisingly, given the magnitude of the economic downturn, house prices have continued their steady gains in recent quarters. The recovery in house prices that began in 2012 continues just as strongly as ever with the recent numbers. Obviously, as I mentioned, the lack of inventory on the market is an important factor in keeping prices strong. But at present, without factoring in inflation, house prices nationally are 20% higher than they were at the last peak in 2006. So, a little bit of nervousness because we know what happened then, but we do seem to be on very solid footing now in terms of continued house price increases. And these gains that we're seeing in house prices give homeowners a nice equity cushion. Also give homeowners a source for financing home improvement projects should they decide to go that route. As I mentioned, though, the geography of house price gains have been changing recently, and changing fairly dramatically. So, in recent years, 2016, 17, 18, even 19, the higher priced West Coast and Northeast Seaboard metros, areas that have seen very strong household incomes, have generally seen the strongest house price gains. But this shows that house price gains since the first quarter of last year, when the pandemic hit, and you can see we're seeing a different pattern here. So that gains have been generally healthy over this period, as I mentioned, but a different mix. So more affordable markets in the South and the Inland West are seeing the strongest house price gains at present. And the Northeast corridor metros, Boston, New York, Philly, DC, are seeing slower gains or declines. I've highlighted Boston there with a modest decline in house prices over this period, and New York with a more significant house price decline. Moving on to home improvement spending, and I'm going to talk about that for the next few minutes. One thing we do in our Improving America's Housing report is try to size the market, and we use a database that's developed by the Census Bureau and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the American Housing Survey, to get these estimates. And so we're just now getting figures from the 2019 American Housing Survey about spending on home improvements and repairs that we use to measure the size of the market. So our definition is a fairly broad one. It includes improvements to owner-occupied as well as rental-occupied units, and it includes maintenance and repair expenditures as well as improvements. So using that figure, that definition, we had about a $460 billion U.S. remodeling market last year. 71% of that spending was by homeowners, 29% by rental property owners, 77% was spending on improving homes, 23% on maintenance and repair of homes. And much of the healthy growth in recent years has come from property improvements, first of all, and second from improvements to the rental stock. We've seen a very strong rental market up until a few years ago, and that's driven a lot of the growth. So, the improvements are the biggest piece of this total. That's the light blue bar at the bottom. It also is the most volatile portion of the market. So it's something we track pretty closely to see how it's moving through the business cycle. And let me talk a little bit about the composition of this homeowner improvement market. It's got a lot of different pieces that we include there, and they are driven by different things that are going on in the economy. So the biggest set of categories in our market definition, you can see in sort of the orange and brown on the right-hand side, are replacements and systems upgrades. And they've been responsible for a lot of growth in the market, given our aging housing stock nationally. But additionally, we're seeing other sources of gain. So households have been spending more time outside their homes, and therefore we're taking on more improvements to the property. So we're seeing strong growth there. Additionally, we've seen some damage recently and some increases in damage recently resulting from natural disasters. So spending on natural disasters and repairs to those has grown to 10% of the market in recent year. And that leaves the kind of purple areas on the lower left there is what we consider to be the more traditional remodeling projects: kitchen and bath remodels, room additions, decks, porches, and things like that. And they, in 2019 and have recently accounted for about 30% of spending in the market. And let me show you sort of how that's varied over the last decade or so. So we've broken these out into 4 categories. Discretionary projects are the ones I talked about: kitchen, bath remodels, additions, decks, and porches. Replacements are exterior replacements, interior replacements, and systems upgrades. And then property improvements and disaster repairs. So, with the unusually low levels of home building over the last decade, our housing stock's been getting a lot older, and with older homes, we're seeing a growing share of spending on interior replacements, exterior replacements, and upgrades, this replacements category on this graph. So the replacement share of spending, which had been averaging, as you can see, about 40% of the market up through the last recession, jumped to 50% coming out of the last recession, and has effectively stayed at that level over the last decade. And then correspondingly, kitchen and bath remodels, room additions, other structural projects fell from about 40% of the market prior to the last recession and have been hovering at about 30% of spending in recent years. And so as a result of that, upper end projects, which we're defining are projects where owners spend at least $50,000 on a project, and that's the brown line here on this graph, that accounted for about half the market prior to the last recession, but it fell to under 30% of the market by 2011. In recent years, we've seen spending in this category, these larger projects, begin to pick up again, but have not yet recovered from where they were prior to the last recession. We also talked about natural disaster repairs, and that's become as I mentioned, another factor that's really influencing spending in this market. Often done by more specialized firms that work in that area, but we do include it in the size of in the measure of home improvement spending. Large scale disasters do come and go, and we have seen a distinct uptick in the trends over the last few decades. So, a couple decades ago, spending on disaster repairs was about a $50 billion market nationally. More recently, it's been averaging about $100 to $150 billion a year in terms of the trend. We had a whopping $320 billion in damage from natural disasters in 2017. So hopefully it won't be repeated again. But as I said, the trend clearly has been up in recent decades. Let me turn a little bit to some look at the local level and metro remodeling spending. We do see healthy levels of improvement spending across the country, but a large share of it is concentrated in major metro areas. So fully a third of the spending nationally occurs in the top 15 metro areas in the country that I've defined here. Half of that spending occurs in the top 5 metro areas in the country. You can see I've highlighted Boston here, number 7 on the list in terms of top metro spending markets in the country, with almost $6 billion in spending on owner improvements in 2019. So a good, a good market to be doing work in, as you well appreciate. And in general, metro areas not only see high levels of total spending on home improvements, but the typical homeowner spends well above the national average in terms of home improvement projects. So, our analysis suggests that every owner in the country on average spends about $3,300 a year on home improvements. That includes those that spend nothing, those that might spend a few $100, and those that might spend $150,000, $200,000, $250,000 on a major project. In 5 of the metros across the country, and those are Denver, Houston, Boston, Portland, and Washington, D.C., the average homeowner spent 50%, at least 50% above the national average on home improvement projects. Spending in Boston, as you can see, averaged $5,200 per owner in 2019. Again, that number is a reflection of those that reported no spending, as well as those that only did minor projects. So does generate a pretty large market size. And recently, the Commerce Department, the U.S. Commerce Department, has been working on developing estimates of the size of economies in the metro area in the U.S. And so by talking about how big the New York economy is, or the Boston economy, we can then compare that to how much is spent on home improvement projects and say, what share of the kind of metro economy does home improvement spending account for? As you can see, the U.S. average 1.6%, so not a big part, but certainly a significant part. And you can see that sort of variation across the 25 major metro areas across the country. Local economies where we see more upper income spending on home improvement projects often have a larger economic base, and so home improvements may not be as dominant as some other factors. So for 2019, the 25 major metro areas, the ones that have the largest share, may not be the markets you think about. Denver, Pittsburgh, Portland, Oregon, Houston, Kansas City all have a high share of spending on home improvements relative to the size of the economy in their local area. In Boston, that share was just under 1.5%. So just about at the national average in terms of the importance of home improvement spending on the local economy. With that background, let me turn to the second topic, which is, I guess I'm going to describe that as what the heck went on with the remodeling market last year. Certainly one of the weirdest years for home improvement activity I think that probably any of us have lived through. And I think the first thing we're trying to decide is really how much activity did we see in home improvement spending last year. We don't have any sort of official numbers yet, so we're trying to piece together how much activity did occur and how much occurred as we kind of flowed through the year. And the way we think about that is probably the easiest way is to think about how much labor was used for home improvement activity. So these are numbers we get monthly from the U.S. Commerce Department. These are part of the monthly employment report, and this measures payroll activity at general remodeling contractors across the country. So how many employees are on the payroll of general remodeling contractors? and how does that vary from month to month as we went through 2020. So there were 383,000 payroll employees at remodeling contractor companies in October of last year. That was the most recent number we have. At the end of this week, we'll get the November number. That's, as you can see, that's more than a 28% increase from that low point in April when we saw the market really collapse. Not only remodeling, but most businesses. But it has bounced back to levels that we've seen, above what we saw at the beginning of the year when, pre-pandemic. So we have bounced back to exceed where we were at before the pandemic started. So that's one piece of the equation. How many workers do we have on payroll? The second thing we factor in is how many hours are they working on average weekly? And that doesn't vary a lot, 36, 37, 38 hours on average, but an extra hour a week worked for the typical worker does amount to a 3% increase in the total volume of labor input in the industry. So it is important. And when you combine those two factors, the number of workers and the average hours that they're working, that's what I've presented here, and I've indexed that to January of that year. So how does that kind of labor input relate back to how it was at the beginning of the year? So the top line is 2019, sort of a more typical year, starting with benchmark to January, and then we saw a modest decline in February, came back in March, and as we got into the summer, we were seeing this sort of labor input up 10%, 11%, 12%. Generally what you see as project activity begins to ramp up a little more in the summer months and then ease as we went through the year. But we're using that as kind of a comparison period to what happened in 2020, where we started out the year pretty well, February, and the March labor report is done in the middle of the month. So it was really before the pandemic took hold, and the numbers were looking pretty good. And then April hit, and as you all well remember, just kind of everything stopped. So we saw, as you can see, almost a 20% decline in terms of labor input to home improvement projects nationally for the month. And then May also still kind of feeling the downside of that, and we saw another 5% decline in terms of labor input. And then by June we were starting to crawl out a little bit. The numbers continued to improve as we moved through the year, not as good as they were in 2019. So I think when we get all the dust settles, we get all the numbers in, probably growth in home improvement spending in 2020 will be a bit below the pace that we saw in 2019. But I think the fact that we're expecting growth once we get the final numbers in for 2020 is still a pretty strong statement, given where we were in April and May, where a lot of businesses were closed down. And in terms of what is the sentiment of contractors and how to break down by different sizes, this is information from the National Association of Home Builders, their quarterly remodeling market index, their RMI, where they look at kind of business confidence levels of contractors on a scale of 0 to 100. So current conditions in the first quarter was a score of 58. Not too bad. Then it improved by the second quarter. Into the second quarter, it bounced up, and by the end of the third quarter, bounced up even higher. So they were feeling pretty comfortable. But I'm using this to kind of look at different types of projects. So small projects, they define as under $20,000. The current conditions were a bit stronger in the first, second, and third quarter, and I think we were seeing that really across the board. That when the market came back, it tended to come back more on smaller projects. Compared to mid-sized projects, we're about like the national average, and then larger projects a little bit lower in terms of their sense of what was going on there. So still reasonably healthy, but this kind of smaller projects coming back first, I think, is a pattern that we've seen throughout the industry. And we saw the same sort of phenomena in a series of surveys that were done first weekly and then monthly by the Farnsworth Group in conjunction with the Home Improvement Research Institute. And they went out to remodeling contractors, and this was asking them, what was the average size of projects that you're seeing now relative to pre-pandemic? And they started these surveys in late March, right as the pandemic hit, to get a sense of it. And early on, I think you can see that the majority of contractors were saying that projects were generally smaller than before the pandemic. But the share that said they were smaller kind of eases off as we got into the summer months. And those that said projects are generally larger, very few were saying that as the pandemic hit. But again, as we moved into the summer months, a larger share were saying that they were in fact larger as we were getting back to normal. But it does depend on kind of what sector you were in. So we broke this down by 3 categories. The first is kind of the general full service remodeler, design build remodeler, and that's the blue line here. And they didn't see an awful lot of improvement early on. Projects were, what share thought projects were larger. It started out at 5% and didn't move up much after that. Even as we got into the summer, not much improvement. Second category was interior specialty contractors. Again, a little bit stronger early on, but didn't see an awful lot of growth. And where we saw the quick rebound was in these specialty exterior contractors, roofing, siding, windows, exterior doors, and things like that, that saw their market come back very strong even as early as May. So sort of 4 to 6 weeks into the pandemic, they were reporting very healthy business conditions that sort of tapered off after that. And that's consistent with a lot of anecdotal information that I have from talking to contractors that they were very nervous, but homeowners felt more comfortable having someone come in and doing a siding project or a window replacement project because they weren't really working in the house, and therefore kind of a safer project to undertake. Let me wind up with kind of some trends that we're seeing that are going to shape 2021 in our view, and talk a little bit about how we see the year shaping up. But I think there's a lot of changes going on out there, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot of them in terms of different sort of market conditions, different sort of influences than we've seen in recent years. And we're still trying to sort out what does that mean in terms of what the market's going to look like as we move forward, not only for 2021, but really in the coming 5 or 10 years after that. So I'm gonna talk about 4 of these. We could make this list a lot longer. I think this is sort of the some of the key ones that we're seeing in terms of how the market is changing moving forward. And the first is certainly been a lot written about this. Locational choices. Where are households deciding to live, and how are they making these decisions differently than they did 5 or 10 years ago? And what does that mean in terms of home improvement activity that we're likely to see? Secondly, how are homes being designed and remodeled, and how is that different than what kind of projects are they focusing on, and again, how is that changing over time? Third is sort of looking a little bit at the non-residential side of the market. The housing market is strong, new construction is strong, remodeling is strong. Commercial construction is exceedingly weak. Offices, retail, lodging facilities continue to be weak, and as a result of that, there's more and more discussion about should we be converting some of these empty offices, some of these empty stores to residential uses or not. And that's a discussion that continues to heat up as we move through this. And then fourth, kind of getting back to that first slide I showed about everything's doing well, but consumers are still nervous. There's a lot of folks that have not been really hurt financially by the pandemic. There's a lot of folks that have been hurt very dramatically by the pandemic. And I think, really important to think about what role do the households that have been financially harmed by the pandemic generally play in the home improvement industry, and what are the implications for that moving forward? So let me walk through these 4 topics very quickly, and then end up with our forecast. So number one was households are choosing to live in different places. Now this is, started out a little bit, I would call it anecdotally. I have a friend that kind of lived in downtown Manhattan and they moved to the Catskills or something else because they didn't want to be, in such a dense urban environment. And it's only been in recent months that we've been able to sort of quantify this a little bit more in some, what I would call harder data. So this is from summer of last year. This is a survey of real estate brokers that was compiled by the National Association of Realtors. And they were simply asked, what kind of places are your clients looking for in terms of making their locational decisions? So a lot of interest in suburbs and subdivisions. Again, probably not a surprise. A surprising amount of interest in small town and rural areas as sort of destination choices. Vacation areas are even reasonably popular destinations. I heard a lot about that. But even though 40% of housing units are in the US are in central cities, very few prospective buyers were looking at those areas in terms of their buying decisions. So I think kind of confirming what we are hearing a lot of people just getting a little nervous about living in dense urban areas. Again, starting to see a little bit of that in the harder data and the actual rent figures. So or vacancy rates. So apartment vacancy rates for downtown locations were running about 7-8% in recent years. They jumped to well over 9% during the pandemic. In contract rental vacancy rates in the suburbs running about 6%. And as we got into the pandemic, those rates dropped even lower. So we could see people that were moving from downtown areas into the suburbs by looking at these vacancy rates. Now, I think once you look at this phenomena a little bit more about why are people moving out of central cities, who's moving out, to what extent is this a permanent as opposed to kind of temporary phenomena, depends on a lot of things. And one thing that I think really drives this is what is your ability to work remotely on a permanent basis. So a lot of folks, I think, their offices were closed. They said, hey, I'll move out of downtown into a, maybe stay at my vacation home for a while and then, come back to work once offices are reopened. So it's more of a temporary phenomena, as opposed to folks that are saying, I don't need to be at my office. I don't particularly want to be in a dense urban area. And so I might think about living there more permanently. And one thing that we thought about in doing that was what types of workers really have the discretion of telecommuting more on a permanent basis. And certainly one group that does that are folks that work in the tech industries. I think the tech industries have been generally pretty supportive of allowing their workers to telecommute. And some of them are saying, and we're not reopening until, mid 2021, maybe the end of 2021, maybe we're not going to reopen at all. We'll encourage our employees to work remotely. We may even require some of our employees to work remotely. So kind of where are the tech industries concentrated, and does that affect, how much you might see of people kind of leaving these areas on a permanent basis? So we looked at a study that was done recently by the Brookings Institution that looked at sort of the growth of tech jobs over the last 15 years or so. And what that study reported is that 90% of the tech jobs on average were on net that were created since 2005 are in just 5 metro areas. 90% of the growth in tech jobs on net are in 5 metro areas across the country. And 4 of those are West Coast, S markets, Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, and San Diego. But the 5th one is Boston. And I think that does produce a little bit of vulnerability in terms of the economic base of an area. A lot of areas spend a lot of money encouraging a lot of tax breaks and other things, encouraging tech companies to move in their areas. And we may find out as a result of that, that those workers are really not living in those areas, that they may be increasingly living someplace else and not providing much to the economic base. But we certainly think that, those markets may be more vulnerable long run to economic growth than we previously thought in terms of how much is technology really going to support a local economy. First topic was location decisions, and a lot behind that too. The second is home design decisions, and I think a lot of you probably are seeing that, and probably know this better than me. But one thing I looked at is a quarterly survey that we do at the American Institute of Architects. We survey residential architects. We ask them a lot of questions about kind of what new features and designs that you're seeing and what's the health of the market. And one thing that we ask about is, what are the most popular special function rooms in homes that you're designing, either new homes or remodeled homes? Now, back during the housing boom prior to the last recession, when we asked this question, we were getting things like home theaters and exercise rooms and wine cellars as some of the more popular special function rooms. Now I think we're seeing things that are really more motivated by changing lifestyles, reflecting what's going on during the pandemic. So outdoor living space is listed by residential architects as the most popular special function area in the home. Number 2, home offices. Number 3, sort of mud rooms, drop zones, things like that, kind of place to store things. 4th, in-law suites, au pair suites, granny flats, whatever you want to call them, kind of an extra unit within the home. 5th was multifunctional space. So again, some of these trends were in place prior to the pandemic, but I think they're reinforced by the way people are living their lives and the way they will continue to live their lives and how they'll be using their space differently. A third topic I mentioned was conversions of commercial space to residential usage. That's something that we have looked at in the past as kind of a source of potential for the remodeling market. And we've found out that typically you see a fair amount of this activity. About 100,000 to 150,000 homes a year are converted from non-residential usages. The reason I think a lot of housing folks don't focus on that, because the number of residential uses that are converted to non-residential uses is about the same number. So it's kind of a wash overall. But I think we are seeing something very different now. As I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of weakness in the commercial markets, office, traditional retail, and lodging. We talked a little bit about that as being a source of weakness here. And you do see a lot of volatility in real estate markets. You see the ebb and flow; they come and go with the cycle. I think the thinking now is that this may be a more permanent change, that some of the drivers of demand for commercial space may be changing pretty dramatically in the long run. So for office space, the numbers are pretty compelling in terms of how many workers are going to be telecommuting either several days a week or full time in the future. So how much office space do we need moving forward? We've seen the growth of e-commerce. We've seen that dramatically increase with this pandemic, and I think the sense is that e-commerce and increase in levels of e-commerce are here to stay. We're not going to go back to the brick and mortar retailing to the extent we were pre-pandemic. And thirdly is lodging. Obviously a lot of that's dictated by travel, business and personal travel. And there clearly hasn't been much of either recently. And I think the sense is that maybe there will be less of that moving forward. Are people going to be flying out for face-to-face conventions in the future, or are they going to do it more virtually? Are people going to be traveling as much in the future? We'll see. But I think that the sense is that we probably will see less demand for commercial space in the future. And we're already hearing more and more reports about conversion projects that are underway to try to repurpose some of this commercial space in the weak commercial markets into stronger residential markets. And let me just run through an example that we're seeing in probably the most obvious area where this is a problem, and that's Manhattan, and sort of some of the figures we're seeing there now. So they're reporting a 14% vacancy in office space. That's high, but not an awful lot higher than we see during previous recessions. But I think a difference now is that even this office space that's not vacant, not for rent, is tremendously underutilized. I saw a report that's saying only about 10% of office workers in Manhattan are reporting to work on a regular basis. That 90% are telecommuting, either permanently or mostly. And as a result, we've seen this decline in commercial rents, 13% over the year. That's a pretty dramatic number. And then there was a study that was done by a business group in New York that said, upwards to 140 million square feet of office space in Manhattan is vulnerable. What they meant by vulnerable is kind of older buildings, less desirable buildings, or buildings that have very high vacancy rates. And that could, just doing a simple back of the envelope math, that could produce about 140,000 apartments or condominiums for Manhattan, in an area that traditionally has been, had a tremendous housing shortage. So we'll see how that plays out. Fourth topic, last one I want to talk about here was what's happening to low and moderate income households that have been affected by the pandemic. And those numbers are actually pretty strong. The Census Bureau is doing some regular household surveys to see how conditions are changing as a result of the pandemic. And they have, the most recent numbers are that they are reporting that 52 million households nationally, so that's about 40% of all households nationally, report that they have lost at least some employment income due to the pandemic. So 40% of households reporting at least some loss in employment income. In general, renters have been harder hit than owners. Over half of renters have seen a lost employment income, as opposed to a little over a third of owners, but those numbers are big on both sides. So what's the result of that? One result is that it's made it very difficult for these households to cover their housing costs. So almost 14 million households, again, 11% of all households nationally are currently behind on their rent or their mortgage payments. That works out to about, as you can see on the right-hand side, about 15% of renters report that they're behind on their rent payments, and almost 10%, a little over 9% of homeowners say that they're behind on their mortgage payments. Now, we haven't, why haven't we heard more about this? And I think the answer is that, up until the end of last year, we did have restrictions on renter evictions and home foreclosures. They have been temporarily extended. We'll see how long they'll be extended. I think regardless, though, at some point, those moratoria will be lifted, and they'll likely be lifted before the economy is fully recovered. So I think, we'll see some results of that. I think we're going to see a lot of owners and renters who are going to need to move to either less expensive housing. They're going to need to double up with friends or relatives, kind of go home and live with mom and dad, or potentially even suffer a spell of homelessness. And so the question we're looking at is, what impact do these lower income households have on home improvement spending? And it turns out they have a fairly significant impact on total market spending, in large part because lower income homeowners tend to live in older homes that are in greater need of upgrading and repair. So I've got some numbers here from a major survey that was just reported out in 2019. It's based on 2017 data that was done by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And they made an effort to try to figure out what the nationally, what the housing rehabilitation needs are. And they broke it down by income levels. So you can see here, less than 100% of the poverty level, so below the poverty line. Almost 43% of homeowners in looking at their homes needed some repairs, where the average cost was about $3,500. They estimated to do that. And there's a higher share and higher cost associated with these repairs for lower income households than they were for moderate, the 10 to 100 and 100 to 200% of the poverty line, or upper income, that's 200% or more of the poverty line. So, tremendous need in terms of home improvement activities for this population that may in fact be diminished pretty significantly given what's going on in the economy. So let me leave it there. Let me end up with in terms of our outlook, this is our leading indicator for remodeling activity. And we'll be updating this in just a couple of weeks to include fourth quarter 2020 data. But the pattern I think is pretty clear. We're seeing, when we were seeing market growth in the sort of 6 or 7% in 2018 or 2019, in 2020, it did fall off early in the year and then began to accelerate a little bit later in the year. That acceleration, I think, will carry over to early 2021, but then we'll see things slow down a little bit. And really what's going on here is sort of some combination, which we don't totally understand yet, in terms of how much work was pulled forward in advance given the pandemic. I'm home. I see some needs on my house that needs to be done. I have a little extra income because I'm not spending that on travel or vacations or eating out or entertainment, things like that. So I think I'll spend it on my home, and I feel more comfortable on projects that are not, interior to my home. So working on the property, working on the exterior of the home. I think, we'll find out that some of those projects will pull forward, and I think we'll find others, these interior projects and these sort of traditional discretionary projects, kitchen and bath remodels, room additions. A lot of homeowners that might have wanted to do those are a little nervous about doing those, have been a little nervous about doing those, and are putting them off. And I think we'll see some of that work materialize in 2021, in 2022. There was a survey done by the National Kitchen and Bath Association of their members, and a lot of their members reported that projects they were working on, obviously kitchen and bath projects, were delayed, but that when they talked to households, they figured at least 80% of those were going to be picked up at some future date. So they weren't canceled. They were just kind of put on hold till the homeowner felt a little more comfortable about having the work done. So I think we're going to see some pent up demand on that side that will help balance off the maybe the pull through work that we saw on the other side. So I'm going to finish up here with just a quick summary of kind of issues that we see influencing the remodeling our outlook, and broken these down into kind of near-term things that are going to affect the outlook in 2021, and as opposed to things that are going to affect the outlook over a longer period of time. So near-term, number one, as I started out with, the remodeling market generally follows the broader residential sector. And those indicators are uniformly very healthy at present. Home sales, house prices, housing starts, things like that. Number two, the more that time that households spend at home, the more issues they see with their current home, and therefore the more modifications they choose to undertake. So I think we're going to see more of these as a lot of households continue to telecommute and their children continue to learn on a distance basis. Number three, improvement spending is concentrated in major metro areas, and areas that are seeing out migration may see less improvement activity in the near term. So, this notion, I think that, everyone's leaving cities and moving to rural areas is clearly an overstatement. But I do think we'll see some cities that do see a kind of a permanent out migration, and others that don't. And so I think we need to deal with that on sort of a case-by-case basis. And then number four, As I mentioned, the pandemic disrupted the normal mix of home improvement projects. Some were accelerated, and I mentioned sort of exterior projects in that category, where others were delayed, and those are kind of major kitchen and bathroom models. And time will tell how much was accelerated and how much was delayed and what the balance is moving forward. And then longer term, millennial buyers are finally buying homes and moving to areas where improvement spending is a popular option. I think a lot of that, when we talked about kind of leaving urban areas and moving to suburbs, is something that would have happened anyways, and it's just being accelerated given what's going on. Number two, I mentioned sort of disaster repairs, and I think that is a long-term phenomenon, that it's going to be an increasing share of activity in the home improvement market. Number three is, as households continue to use their homes differently, we're likely to see different composition of home improvement projects. Moving forward, there's likely to be more demand for space, more flexibility in the use of that space, and more accommodation for multi-generational households. I think that's a permanent phenomena, either older parents coming to live with their adult children, or adult children moving back with their parents, likely to continue. And then finally, there's a large slice of the population that has seen financial setbacks with the pandemic, and that will be less involved in the home improvement market until their financial situation improves. And again, I think that's likely to be a longer term phenomenon moving forward. So a lot of facts and figures there, but hopefully we have at least a few minutes for questions or discussion. And Michelle or Catherine, are you going to moderate that?
I'm here.
You're there, Michelle. Go ahead.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So we did have one question from Rachel White from Bigmeister. Is there any date of vacating in more suburban or rural locations? And Rachel, if you want to unmute and clarify or add, feel free to do that.
Just say a little more about that if you would.
See if I can find her on here and unmute her. Where are you, Rachel? So I think the question came in when you were talking about the movement of folks out of the cities and into the suburbs. And so I think what she was asking is, do we have a sense that that's sort of a momentary thing related to the pandemic and that will end up subsiding, or is that something that we think will be a more lasting change?
And I think the answer is all of the above to that, Michelle. I think we saw a lot of temporary moves. If I, for example, lived in downtown Boston, but owned a vacation home in New Hampshire, likely to relocate there during the pandemic. If I lived in downtown Boston and was thinking of buying a vacation home on the Cape, I might say now's a good time to buy one, and I'll sit out the pandemic in that vacation home before I return to work. I talked about the millennial households that are have a young child or getting ready to move to the burbs, but kind of not ready to yet. They like being downtown, like being access to shopping, work, other commercial activities, until the pandemic hit and said, I don't like being downtown so much anymore. So, I was going to buy a home in the burbs over the next year or two. I think I'll do it now. And just sort of accelerate that a little bit. So I think we're seeing a lot of different motivations for doing this, and some of them are temporary, but I think clearly there are some that are permanent. And that's why I gave the example of sort of the tech jobs and things like that. I think there's a lot of reason to think that tech workers, that there's incentives for them to locate in areas that are cheaper, maybe in areas that are more preferable to them, particularly because of the pandemic, that really may not be coming back to work in their office after that. And so those are going to be permanent moves, I think, permanent moves to different areas of the country.
Makes sense. We probably have time for one or two more questions. I see Vaughn.
Yes.
Go ahead, Vaughn.
Kermit, in terms of your calculations here, in terms of spending in the various markets and the like, is there any adjustment that's been made due to the appreciation in costs here of building materials? And is that localized, or is that pretty much endemic throughout the country, that increase?
The answer to your second question, part of your question, Vaughn, I think is that it's pretty clear that higher prices are a national, not a local phenomenon. What I don't know as much about is, in addition to prices, we're also talking about fairly dramatic increase in lead times for products too, and I don't know if that's more local than national, or if that varies. My guess it doesn't, because production tends to be pretty much national for appliances or whatever else we're seeing 2, 3, 4 month delays on here. But I don't think there's any reason to think that any of those are particularly worse in Boston than other parts of the country. That there's pretty much a national market for all the products I think that we're using in remodeling.
Thank you.
Great. Eric had a question. Eric, can you unmute and go ahead?
Thank you. Kermit, I guess a related question to Vaughn's is, I was looking at slide 6, I believe, where you're showing the graph of spending in billions since 1995. I'm just wondering if in that 25, 26-year period, if those are just absolute dollar figures, or if they're adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, they are not. Those are sort of market expenditures. I think if you did adjust those, and we do that sometimes, what you'll see is that spending levels in 2019 were almost back to, but not quite back to, what they were in the previous peak. I think it was 2007 or 2006. So inflation has accounted over the last decade for most, if not all, the growth that we've seen in spending. And inflation's been, as we just talked about, a little bit higher recently, because we're seeing some fairly dramatic increase in the cost of doing a home improvement project.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
We can take one more question. Kathleen Follett asked, have you factored in pinches in supply chains, shipping delays, manufacturers issues with furloughed employees, lead times during COVID time?
We haven't measured that, or we haven't factored that into any of our projections. I mean, certainly when we talk to contractors, we one theme we hear is that our backlog is up, but our current level of production is, in often cases, down, I think. And it's a lot of this phenomenon, some combination of, I want to do that project, but not right now, so I'm going to put it off for a while, or I want to do that project now, and the contractor saying, great, we'll get started, and we can deliver. We can deliver these products in 3 or 4 months. So kind of a built-in delay for that, I guess, because of the supply chain issues that we're seeing for all the reasons that you mentioned there. It just got caught short. I think the lumber situation was really a lot of mills in March and April saying, well, this is going to kill the housing market, so we can shut down these lumber mills for a while, and then discovered that no, it really didn't kill the housing market, and so got caught short. And then I think on other things that we're still seeing now, we talked about sort of appliances and things like that being 2, 3, 4 months back ordered, has to do with just sort of COVID related concerns of these production facilities. They just can't keep up with their production schedules because they've lost so many workers, at least temporarily.
Makes sense. Great. Well, Kermit, thank you so much as always for your time and all of the wonderful, insightful information. It's always a delight to have you here with us. And I hope that in a year when we hear from you again, it will be that we're together in person and having all good news about the future. So thank you so much. We're going to leave the session open here for a few minutes of networking. We know folks are really eager to connect with one another. So if you'd like to stay on for a few minutes and network and connect with colleagues, please do. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Kermit, and we'll look forward to seeing you in person sometime very soon.
Good. Michelle, good to be with you here again.
Thank you. All right, guys, so you can unmute yourselves if you want to connect and take a few minutes to say hi to one another. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle. Joanne.
Congratulations, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep, now the hard work begins.
Yeah, well, you guys are going to help me, right?
Sure.
Justin
How you
just
doing,
emailed me
Greenie?
all the stuff that he does behind the
Justin,
scenes that he didn't
yeah.
tell you about.
Yeah, no, it's actually much harder than I'd mentioned.
Oh, no. Thanks.
Justin, wipe that smile off your face. You look too happy right now.
Tim
I'm
running
happy
out the
because
door.
You guys were such a tremendous group to be a part of.
Well, remember that you're still chairman of the board.
Yes, I'm still involved.
That's the real fun.
You can
I have
run,
a
but you
quick
cannot
question.
hide.
Yeah, who said they have a question?
Kathy?
I am writing the story and I'm wondering if people have any key takeaways from the presentation they want to share.
Oh, good idea, Cheryl.
And they can email me or you can tell me now.
Anybody got the top thing they walked away from? Anything really new that was surprising?
Well, I think what I found was it was interesting to see the position of Boston, that we were somewhere down at 6 and 7 in terms of the expenditures for those various markets. You know, I always thought we were such a hot spot, but yet there are still half a dozen markets that kind of exceeded us in terms of their expenditures and what was going on in the past year in those markets. So I think that was enlightening to see where we stood nationally.
Anybody else have a take? Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I think generally speaking, just seems like activity levels are forecasted to be relatively stable going into 2021. You know, there's looking at certain metrics, you have some positive kind of upticks and in others, some moderate, you know, shifts downwards. But I guess my takeaway in the end is that we're looking at a pretty stable market. I think that should be good for us, given the amount of activity going on right now.
I think what I took away is that we're going to get real busy, busier than we are. Our lead times are way out there. And I think in our chat room, Greg Antonellis said maybe it's time for all of us to think about charging a little more and shortening our lead times, managing our manpower better by making more money on profit and not just on labor. So I think we can all work on that a little and not be afraid.
I guess I was surprised to see the pattern of more smaller projects. I saw more people with inquiries with larger projects or multiple projects. So maybe multiple small ones, but there were some bigger projects like additions or in-laws. Adding things that are not there. Bathrooms, kitchens, adding more, multiple groups. So I was surprised to see the pattern of just little smaller projects.
But that's a national number. So I mean, I think when you start looking at national numbers, in many cases, that's all people, you know, can afford, you know, and you know, let's face it. I mean, somebody who family that makes, you know, $100,000 here and a family that makes $100,000, you know, in Tennessee somewhere, you know, they might be able to, you know, pull together, you know, different needs when you need a bathroom. So sometimes people put a Band-Aid and sometimes they build it out.
Right.
I was a little reassured by the demographic migration data, because I think I had in my head this vision of, you know, a mass exodus from the Boston area where everybody went and lived in the Adirondacks somewhere and telecommuted. And the data showed more that maybe people didn't want to be right downtown, but that the suburbs were still really viable. And for, you know, a little agrarian town like Boston with a bunch of cowpaths in it, you know, that's really just made up of a whole bunch of little town suburbs, it's sort of reassuring to see that, you know, maybe people will be content to spread out to the suburbs. And that's, you know, at least for some of us, that's a good place for where our market stands. So.
I mean, I know somebody looking for a home for $1.6 million somewhere in Wayland, and, you know, there's nothing on the market. Can't find it. Sorry. Too bad. Trying to move out of the city.
I'll sell them my house, Jody.
Who's that?
That's Eric.
Eric.
Do you live in Wayland, Eric?
No, but close by.
I just heard this morning there was a, you know, they put a house on the market for like 2.3 million in Weston, and, you know, they had 32 bids on it and went for $100,000
No
over
way.
asking. I mean, you know,
That's
so
crazy.
you know, that it is crazy, but it is, you know, people, young people moving out of Boston, their real estates might not be worth quite as much as it was worth maybe a year ago, but it's still worth a lot of money.
I think it's good to hear too that millennials are starting to make their mark on the market that we can see nationally. You know, it's at least in my own perception, that's been a delay from what I think most generational trends have been. And so I think, I hope that we'll see in the, you know, next year and years to come that they start to take over a larger and larger percentage of, you know, our clientele and the people that make up a lot of these charts.
Totally, I find that's true too, because I mean, each year that goes by, I find my clientele just gets younger and younger.
I love it.
Funny how that happens.
I'm wondering
That's funny.
how much of that millennial buying power is actually being funded by their boomer parents. And we're seeing more than one occasion where two generations are now proposing to cohabitate. And so it's not the millennials buying power, it's still their parents buying power. And the parents are at that age where living alone anymore, the aging in place is kind of shifting a little bit to let's age in a single family or even a multi-family, but the other unit is occupied by my kids. And we can help them out now that they're getting squeezed out of their apartment or whatever, so that there's some creative financing and living situations coming together. So
I think that they've all survived the pod, you know, like they started early on doing, you know, working with this pod, and they're seeing that it works too. So because I'm getting more calls for that as well, more basements, more in-law suites and things like that. Because they need the help, or in some cases their college kids or whatever coming home to live with them because they're, you know, they're not in classes or schools and things like that. But I agree with you, they're definitely more multi-generational.
I saw a statistic where millennials own, I think something like, it was crazy, I don't know the exact, but it was like 6% of the nation's wealth, where boomers at their age owned 24%. And I don't think that their economic situation is necessarily improving that much, but it's the trickle down from mom and dad.
When I think,
Yeah, I hear that's I hear that stat from my son a lot.
Well, I'm seeing a different approach. I'm seeing a lot of savings and a lot of lifestyle changes that have added more funds to the savings for a lot of these young folks. So they're taking the jump because they don't have the increased childcare costs because they're doing it themselves at home. They're not commuting as much. That second car is disappearing. They're putting that money away that would have gone out to eat on a weekly basis and dumping that into savings. So they're seeing some real input into those cash reserves and giving them the opportunity. And with the interest rates as low as they are, they're really looking at the situation as the time to buy. And it's, in a lot of cases, the starter home.
Well, I think in third quarter reporting, in personal savings had increased a huge exponential amount. And I'm not sure again what the exact number was, but I believe it was well over 50% in the increase in personal savings that occurred, second or third quarter of 2020. So the other thing I think that kind of bears out what Greg was saying is that if you look at real wage growth and you look at percentages of wage growth hasn't been that strong in the past year. So I think that bears out maybe some of where the money may be coming from, because it's either coming from savings or it's coming from another source, but it hasn't been an appreciable wage growth.
Yeah, I heard it attributed to the GI Bill in a crowd of people, and everybody looked at each other saying the GI Bill, and the speaker said, yeah, the generous in-laws.
That's funny. I like it.
Well,
Very good, guys. Go ahead, Kathy. Do you want to?
Well, I'm with Bill in terms of if we're seeing an influx of inquiries, why not shift up our pricing a little bit? Makes sense, right? But the shift of inquiries I'm seeing are more millennials who want to buy, and they have a big share of in the market of purchasing power, but their budget is lower. So we're going to have to go through and weed out them, but they're out there. Their inquiries are bigger. We have to work with them. How does one? It takes time, right? We have to take time and consider their budget, or be, I guess, more cut to the chase and be more transparent with what things cost. I don't know if you're seeing it, that I'm seeing it. So I was wondering if the group is seeing more shift of more younger buyers in wanting to remodel.
Yeah, we're seeing it. Some of them, it's still a small percentage that are good fits for us. We're seeing more calls in younger demographic, but usually the budget is the hurdle, or
But not always, because some of them, have had a 10-year run with a startup that they co-founded, and there's a certain slice of that market that's sort of saying, we want what we want it now because we've got a young family, and we're good to go, let's go. So I think that's, Kathy, right? It's like everything else. You gotta qualify the leads and sort out who's a good fit for what you do and what your goals are for your company, and stick to your guns.
Yeah.
I had a young family who when it came down to what they wanted to do, just basically said, okay, we're going to do it. And I kind of couldn't figure out how they were going to fund this. And they had a 2-bedroom apartment that they had in Boston, and they just sold it. They just got she said, we can't deal with this. I'm in this house with 3 kids.
Yeah.
And it funded the whole thing. They thought
We had
they'd be making a town.
Similar situation. We were beneficiaries of a GI situation last year, where I tried to, I thought when I qualified these people, we almost didn't follow up on the lead, because I thought there's just no way, from what I was seeing as kind of initial indicators, and no problem. They did the initial scope and more. And we're doing another one now in Cambridge, where again, these people, by all kind of normal metrics, wouldn't be able to afford it, but they just inherited money. So
you never know.
Yeah, you never know. So those are 2 recent lessons for me that I'm definitely broadening my qualification criteria.
I think it's worth it to have a conversation with people and to, at least for me, to, to just ask the question. So lots of times I like to go see the project before I ask the question, and it's worth that amount of time to educate them and to talk to them about all the ramifications of what they need to do, and sometimes including moving out, and subsequent other homes. And so it's, I think it's really interesting. My concern though is really, and I didn't know if I should ask Kermit this, was, all these towns and all the retail that's going out of business in these towns, the towns themselves, the tax basis is changing a lot, and then they have to get the money somehow, elsewhere. So some of these higher tax towns are really going to start seeing, even higher tax basis, because they're not getting the rents from, say, the Natick Mall, because places are going out of business, or the downtown merchants and the buildings that are, the commercial buildings that are now being, that people are just moving out of because they don't necessarily need the space and they're not renewing their leases. So everybody's asking for tax abatements. I mean, certainly all through Natick and the Route 9 corridor, that's happening. And I'm assuming it's happening in other towns. So it's a question of will, as much as people want to come to the suburbs, do they want to pay the tax rates that's going to happen in these, in these towns, around us. So my 2 cents.
I don't know how much it's gonna be. I mean, there will be some ripple effect from this, but I think people are also gonna get tired from working from home. They're gonna get cabin fever, maybe.
That's why that's why they want their outdoor living.
Yeah.
Want their pools.
Or even
Their
to
pools, right.
get a small office space in their hometown rather than drive into Boston, but just to have a separate space that they can go to. Or Starbucks is going to have to double in size because there are that many more people there with their laptops and whatever. I don't think people are going to be that happy staying that much of the time. And that's not a comment on my home life, by the way.
Long term.
Another deck.
I'm still coming to work every day.
I love it.
I feel sorry for all the dogs personally.
It's too funny.
When people go back to work, they're not going to know what to do with themselves. They're just going to eat all the furniture, all the puppies, all the dogs.
That's correct. Our furry friends love us home.
Pandemic dogs. Yes.
Time to open a dog walking business.
Mhm.
There you go. Right.
Good to see you, everybody. Kathy, if you
Thank
have
you,
any
Roger.
questions or want
Thank
any
you so
help.
much.
let
All
me
right,
know.
guys. Yeah, we'll wrap
Happy
it
New
up.
Year.
It was.
Thanks, Kathy.
Hey, Roger.
Happy New Year.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks. All right.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Right. Bye.
Bye.